Hey everyone, it's Monica. Welcome back to Homeschool Voices. It's the end of the year and a lot of you are seriously considering pulling your kids out of public school, and some of you are actually considering putting your kids back in. So today's video is which is better, public school or homeschool? There are a lot of considerations to take into account when making this kind of decision. There's financial considerations, there are mental health considerations, and there are just sort of basic considerations about what is in the best interest of your child. So in today's video, I'm going to speak to what is in the best interest of the average child. Obviously, you are probably going to have all kinds of other considerations that you will need to take into account as well. So the first area is academics. Your average American who does go to a public school also reads at a 7th to 8th grade reading level. So public schools are not doing well in reading. Your average American struggles to write. In fact, your average American who goes into college has to go through sort of a remedial writing process. It is a very common complaint of professors that freshmen do not know how to write. So this is a very well-known problem in America. So again, public schools are failing with reading, they're failing with writing, and I can guarantee that the average American struggles badly with middle school math. Almost every single parent out there, by the time your kid gets to middle school math, you're struggling to one extent or another. And even if you're not struggling, you know what I'm talking about. So many parents have such a hard time. This is not ideal. There are workarounds, obviously. I have a lot of friends who struggle with math, yet they still live successful, happy adult lives, but it would be nice to know these things. It does make life a little bit easier. It really is the ideal to have a solid knowledge of middle school math. So again, your average American struggles in this area and your average American went to public schools. So public schools are failing in reading, in writing, and math. Those are your basics, and public schools are failing. And for me, it's a big problem when the basics are not being attended to, and then there's all these other random, weird, new agey kind of things that are being taught to kids in school that 50% of parents don't even agree with, and then kids have trouble reading and doing basic math. There are some things that I hear from parents regularly. For example, my kids don't listen to me, but they listen to their teachers. Well, what evidence do you have to really support that claim? Do your kids really listen to their teachers, or do they talk to their friends? Do they write notes? Do they stare at squirrels outside? Do they doodle? Are they actually listening to your teachers? Is it really more that you care more, so you are trying to insist that your child listens, whereas your teacher, it's not that they don't care, but they have 20 or 30 kids that they're trying to deal with. They're not going to be that hyper-focused on one kid spacing out and not really learning a lot. So what I'm getting at is I'm not so sure that your kid really listens to the teacher that well. And on another level, maybe you need to not be so worried about super fast academic progress, and maybe worry a little bit about developing a good sense of discipline and a good work ethic in your child. So if your child is spacing out or not listening or fighting with you, maybe that needs to be your main focus, because we get so hung up on academics that we forget that there are other really important things about raising a child and bringing them into adulthood. And it's not just academics. Work ethic is huge. Discipline is huge. Another thing that I hear is that there's this sort of positive social pressure that you will get in school. So there's lots of negative social pressures, but in a way there is a positive social pressure that will happen. So if your kid has a tendency to be a little lazy, but they don't want to do such a bad job that they're embarrassed, so maybe they work a little harder. And again, to me, that's not necessarily a reason to put your kids back into public school. It is a good thing to notice and to identify that your child has a tendency to slack when they are not being pressured, when they're not receiving outside pressure. And that is something to work on, in my opinion. You don't really want to always rely on that outside pressure. You want to teach your kids to have motivation that comes from within, and that does take time, and it's not easy. But while we're talking about social stuff, let's talk about the other side of things. So homeschoolers get asked all the time, how do you socialize your kids? And the funny thing is, as a homeschooler, I wonder, for those of you whose kids are in public school or have been in public school, how did you deal with all the negative social influences that your kid is absorbing in public school? It's hard to imagine how you undo that when you have so little time with your kids. And especially if your kids have after school activities, you have very, very little time with them to undo all the negative socialization that they receive. A lot of people are really concerned that their kids are going to be lonely, and you know what? It's a valid concern, and a lot of homeschoolers blow this off. Now, personally, I am exhausted most of the time because we are so social, but it did take time for me to build that social network, that community, and it took a lot of work. So if you are going to homeschool, you have to psychologically prepare yourself to really put some serious work in for a good year to build your local community, or even just like your personal community. And you cannot just sit home all day every day and say, gosh, my kid's lonely. Well, yeah, your kid's lonely because you're not scheduling things for them. Especially as they get older, it gets more and more important the older they get, because the other kids get very stuck in their ways and they don't want to branch out. So you're going to have to put that work in to make sure that they have a social life. But once you do it, you'll have to start turning things down because you'll have so many opportunities. Let's talk about safety, and there's a lot of different aspects to safety. Obviously, school shootings are a big thing. So in my own life, when I was in high school, the neighboring high school, there was a shooting. 2 people died. There was a kid and the vice principal were shot and killed. And a couple of years down the line, I moved to Colorado. I was connected to the Columbine shooting. A few years down the line, I'm here in Santa Clarita, California. There's a shooting at the local high school. 3 kids died. It's not uncommon. In fact, I think everybody, especially when you have high school age kids or even middle school age kids, you know that it's not uncommon. You know that it's a real threat because so many people have the mentality that they want to send their kids to school with a cell phone. Why? Because they're actually genuinely worried that there could be a shooting and they will not be able to get in touch with their child. To me, that is a big problem. You're sending your child into a situation where you actually think that you're going to need to get in touch with your kid because there could be a shooting. But it's not just shootings, right? There are lots of fights, even in good schools, even in good areas. Where I live is a really good area. The schools are supposed to be really good. And there are a lot of fights. In addition to fights, there's things like stabbings. There's bullying. Bullying is obviously huge. We all know that it's a big deal. And I think with some of the stuff with public schools, we're tempted to say, well, that's just the way the world is, or that's just normal. Well, it's not normal. You know what? Bullying is really not normal in the homeschool world. I'm sure that it does happen, but not to the extent that it happens in public schools. And you have a lot more of an ability to deal with bullies in a homeschool setting than in a public school setting, because in a public school setting, it's just allowed to continue. Very often that bullying it keeps happening because there's no real repercussions, there's no real punishment that happens. And then of course there's predators that prey on our children in schools, and yes, it is very common. I guarantee you're going to be listening to my video and you're going to say, not in my school. Really? How do you know that? I can't tell you how common it is for me to hear about some coach or some music teacher or some English teacher who was having inappropriate relationships with students, or did something even worse, not even a relationship, with a student. It's not uncommon. Again, in my town here where I live, since I have lived here, there was a coach and he was fired, hopefully he was arrested, and he had inappropriate relationships with the students. This is really common. In my high school, it happened there too. This is not something that you're really going to get away from. And I know the vast majority of teachers would never even think of doing something like this, but there are a certain number that are doing it. I'm just going to mention a couple of random things. One would be maturing too quickly. Again, in our society, we think all of this stuff is normal. We think it's totally normal for a 10 or 11-year-old girl to act like they're 20 years old and to be prancing around and wearing super tight clothes and really short shorts. It's not normal. And when your child is in a homeschool setting, you can exert a lot more control yes, control and influence over your child's life so that they can have a healthy and ultimately happier childhood when they're not being encouraged to be a full-grown adult way too soon. Another pet peeve of mine is this idea that being smart is bad, and it's really common in public schools, and you just don't see that nearly as much in a homeschool setting. Kids are really free to be who they are. If they're slow in certain areas, they don't really get picked on because the other kids don't really know about it for the most part. If they're super smart in other areas, they certainly don't get picked on because, again, the other kids don't know about it. So I like that. I like for my kids to have pride in their abilities, or if they're having trouble, for them to be able to just work at their own pace. Public schools magnify our image-obsessed culture. So anything that you see in the culture, you're going to see magnified in public schools. And this obsession with the brand of clothing, how new is the clothing, how new is your backpack, how new is your this, your that, all of this, it's awful. It is the wrong way to be as a human being. It is objectively wrong to be quite that obsessed with your image. What happens in a public school setting is there's this very, very unhealthy obsession, and it also turns into bullying. So again, this is a reason why I don't want my kids in that environment. And that would all be fine and good if you could go to the teachers, if you could go to the principals, if you could go to the school boards and they would do something. They don't do anything. They don't care, and they don't like you. The vast majority of teachers do not care what you think. They think you're stupid. They think they know everything, and they think they know how things should be done. And they don't care. That's why so many parents are so upset and nothing is happening and nothing is changing. And you know what? It won't change. The only way it will ever change is if you take over these school boards and you make changes, but that is going to take over your life. And is your kid really benefited from that approach? Or is it better just to pull your kid out of that public school and do a good job yourself and stop trying to save the entire school? So there are a lot of problems with public schools. The academics, the most important thing about schools, are atrocious. Public schools are a failure with the basics, with basic academics. The social atmosphere is very toxic. Even if your child loves it, even if your child loves being in public school, that social atmosphere is very negative. It is not a good social atmosphere. It's dangerous. So for me, I'm not really seeing a compelling reason. I do see reasons, however, why homeschooling is difficult. Your kids can be very challenging. You may have some trouble with some of the subject areas. Your mental framework about what does school look like and what should you be doing with your child and what should your child learn are all playing into your experience and sometimes causing a lot of stress for you. Homeschooling is a whole different way of life. It's a whole different way of looking at raising your children and education. And as you watch my videos, you're going to start to think about things in a different way. But if I ever gave you the impression that it's easy, I am so sorry. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work. It can be emotionally draining. You have to be very persistent. You have to always be reflecting on what's working, what's not working, where are the problems, how can I fix the problems? But you have to know that you're doing this for higher reasons, right? Because it's the right thing to do. Because public schools are broken. And if you are doing it because it's the right thing to do and because public schools are broken, it doesn't matter if you have problems. You're just going to figure out those problems. You're not going to say, well, I have problems, so I'm going to put my kids in a broken public school system. I'm sure you probably could have guessed that's what I would have said from the beginning of this video. And I know that there are other considerations, but as far as I'm concerned, academics, safety-wise, all of that, I really can't see a good reason to put a child in public school. I hope that that was helpful. If you have any more input, if you have any thoughts on this, please tell me in the comments below. If you like this video, please click thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, please click subscribe and the notification bell next to it. In the meantime, happy homeschooling and have a great day.